So let's move forward. So book club. Yay. All right. So far, we're going to do this for only 5-10 minutes.
Mhm.
Chapters 1 and 3 for this week. I'm going to be doing chapter 2 in place of Michelle. Lisa's doing chapter 1. I'm doing
Mhm.
chapter 2, and Sheila will be doing chapter 3. So Lisa, we talked about the fat paradox, good health on a high-fat diet. So tell us a little bit about chapter 1. Just walk us, through it really quickly.
Well, first of all, I want you to know that I read this while I was queasy, and I cursed every minute of it.
And you
Oh,
what?
no.
I cursed you every minute.
Oh, because you eat crackers?
Because, oh, no, I was just so nauseous. And I'm reading, basically they were talking about how the Inuits in Canadian Arctic eat mostly meat, and it's, raw caribou. And the blood and the organ meats, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, I thought I was gonna really lose it just reading that. But the point really was that 70 to 80% of the calories came from fat in their diet, and they really had no witnessed obesity or diseases, especially cancer and diabetes. And then this scientist or anthropologist that was observing them, he then entered Bellevue Hospital, and he ate basically meat and water only. And he started in the hospital for a year. After 3 weeks of healthy testing, he actually went home under supervision. And, whenever he did eat lean meat without the fat, it brought on diarrhea and discomfort, which I thought was quite interesting.
That is interesting.
And the symptoms would go away after he ate fatty meals. So after the year was up, the men who were in the study were healthy. 50 years later in Africa, they started looking, at what the natives were eating there. And, it was a popular hypothesis at that time that animal fat equaled heart disease, which is, of course, what we all think. So the natives there drank 2 to 7 liters of milk, ate fatty beef. 60% of their calories were from animal sources, and they didn't eat vegetables at all.
Right.
So, and again, it was the same concept that although, they had these high-fat diets, their blood pressure didn't go up with age, as was thought, here in Western. And but they did make points that they were free of emotional and competitive stress. And I think that's a big piece there too. And that they have more exercise because, the Westerners rely more on cars and whatnot. But they did say also that the elders in these tribes, that they were more sedentary and they still didn't have the heart disease. Then they looked into Kenya. Again, no heart disease, no cancer, no diabetes. Native Americans, they live longer, no cancer. The only cancer I thought this was really interesting was fibroids, being a woman. They didn't have any atherosclerosis, plaque buildup. And I did think that was interesting. They talked about hunting patterns, and again, the eating of the organ meat, the highest fat. I can't do that.
Yeah. No one's asking you to do that, but yeah, it is interesting how a lot of these indigenous cultures, whether it was back in the 1900s or even 1800s, or even today, ones who have been relatively untouched by Western civilization, how healthy they are. And, if you look at what they ate, not only does it disgust you just thinking about eating a heart or an eyeball or something like that, but they're actually just healthier across the board in all of their bloods, and they rarely die of a cancer or heart disease or stroke or, some of the things that are most common in terms of the causes of death, here in the United States and in much of Western civilization. So, yeah, it is. Oh, go ahead.
The processed food too. I think that's a big culprit in a lot of the issues that we have disease-wise.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you gotta eat relatively fresh food. And if you buy food and you put it in the fridge, it's still going to go bad in a few days if it's a good quality food. If it's lasting weeks and weeks, then, there's probably something wrong with it. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think we were all raised on a good degree of processed foods, but the good news is that we can undo a lot of that damage. And that's obviously something I've been working on personally for many years, but Yeah, it just goes to show you how crazy it is that people who you'd think, I guess for some stupid societal differences because we're more technologically advanced and we have more civilized civilizations, that we should be in better health and all that, but they actually have much better quality of life outside of not having electricity and toilets and all that stuff. So cool. Anything else about the first chapter that you wanted to add in or that you thought was interesting?
No, that was really it. Just I would never want to do that while queasy again.
Yeah. I think for the remainder of this book, a good rule is that if you're queasy, let's not read anything about it, because you'll probably read something that will
But I have
repulse
to say,
you.
I mean, I think I got the better chapter though.
Yeah.
The other two, it's very fact filled and kind of it was a little dry, I thought.
Yeah. A lot of these books, and you're lucky I didn't make you read the one I was thinking about because it's longer and drier. But yeah, it is. The reason that I'm having you read it is because I know you guys are on board. You've been keeping your macros around these ranges and you're keeping your net carbs down. You're eating, a higher fat diet and you're on board. But I want you to really, just like with intermittent fasting, I want you to really understand where I got my information, and why I believe that what we're doing is the best route, not just for weight loss, but for improving your health in general. So that brings us to chapter 2, which starts the shit show. So I'm going to cover Michelle, why we think saturated fat is unhealthy was the title of the chapter. So it reviews much of the history of Ancel Keys, who's the biggest scumbag in the history of health and medicine. He had a hypothesis that high cholesterol intake, high fat intake overall equals a higher chance of heart disease, even though he had even come across studies and at times believed that there were certain types of fat, primarily omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, that could hydrogenate during the processing of foods, and you mentioned that, Lisa, before, and thus become trans fat, which has been linked to heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and all that fun stuff. So that was his hypothesis, and then there were groups like the Maasai who disproved this, and nations today are starting to rescind restrictions on dietary cholesterol, aside from us, of course, because we're always like last to the ball when it comes to changing our health. And then again, type of fat that causes these things versus all fats. Ancel Keys was dead set on demonizing all dietary fat. And his hypothesis always seemed to matter more than the actual results. So that's why he had like the Swedish paradox and things like that, things that he couldn't explain. And he used his 7 countries study to help support his hypothesis, because in those 7 countries, it's seen that that was the case, whereas in much of the rest of the world, it was not the case. So the chapter also explored, could it have been that, during war times was part of his reasoning, that because there was less dietary fat was his thinking in the population because we were at war, that people didn't have quite the same rates of heart disease as they did when they returned, but there was also much less sugar. So the author, Nina, argued that it was probably the sugar instead of the fat. And then they start going into, I forget the guy's name, but he had a guy who really, really disagreed with him over this, and he thought sugar was the culprit, but because Keys had so much pull in the medical community, he kind of demonized this guy and ostracized him, and anybody who disagreed with Keys lost funding, and even people on their deathbeds or much later in life who the author had interviewed, including his right-hand man during all his time, said that if anything disagreed or anyone disagreed with his thinking, he would really, really go out of his way to screw them over. So that's essentially what chapter 2 is all about. And yeah, I mean, I've known this for a long time. And that's why when I first heard about it and I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, I read a book by Gary Taubes, who's an investigative journalist, called Good Calories, Bad Calories. And he went into this story in vivid detail. So that's one of the drier books that I helped you guys avoid. And he really broke it down. He used documentation and different things and anecdotes from not just Key's right-hand man, but several other people who worked with him over the course of his like 50 or 60 years in the field. And it's pretty terrible that this guy ignored a ton of evidence that would have omitted his hypothesis, because as a scientist, scientists are trained, even if they have a hypothesis, they're supposed to do everything in their power to disprove it. And only when they've literally tried everything they can think of and it still holds true can they potentially call it fact. He was doing it in the reverse. And because of his sway in the medical community and even with governmental bureaucrats, he changed almost single-handedly the dietary guidelines of this country. And I don't like to blame people individually for anything. I feel that sometimes everyone's to blame in some capacity. But if I were to point a finger at one person for why all this has happened, the increase in obesity and diabetes, heart disease, and all this stuff, I think it's him. And it was just because he was hell-bent on proving something that turned out to not be 100% accurate. And yeah, those are my thoughts on chapter 2. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I think it's like a lot of things political.
Yeah, and that's actually the last sentence in chapter 3 was, it's more political than scientific. And that's exactly what it was. So.
Yeah. It was, yeah, and that's also, and we go into that a little bit more about how there was evidence in the 40s and 50s that it was sugar and grains and different things, and they bought off government bureaucrats. So in addition to Ansel Keys, who was hell-bent on proving this hypothesis, it was like a match made in heaven for them to come to prominence. But unfortunately, it was at the public's disservice. So Sheila, let's get into chapter 3 and let's talk a little bit more about that.
Right, and that's when the low-fat diet was introduced, and the American Heart Association was, they started out having minimal money, and it ended up turning into billions of dollars for research. And so I blame kind of the American Heart Association too, because I think they were very much about wanting to stick to this hypothesis. And so they were not open either to anything that went against it. And Key, obviously, he went out of his way to oppose or to go against, and including Mann and Stevenson and some of the other guys that were questioning it. And so, it was very political, not scientific at all. They talked about Framingham, which is near Boston, where they did a lot of, it was probably the largest scale attempt for doing some different testing and research on a large group of people. And, they were looking at, is high cholesterol connected to heart disease? Well, there are many different factors, including smoking, stress, all those different exercise, all of those different things. And later they found out that cholesterol wasn't directly correlated. It wasn't a reliable predictor, but they never shared that in any medical reviews. They also found that saturated fat was not related to heart disease. But that was contrary to what the American Heart Association and Key wanted. So that again was never published or never, and the author was talking about that it'd take you forever to find this research because it was buried under all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And so, Mann, who opposed Keyes, he lost grant money. It pretty much ruined him. He wasn't in any publication anymore. So, it ended up being, like, as you said, later on when he was in his 90s, talked about that you had to go along with the American Heart Association in order to get the research dollars. So you pretty much just had to say, okay, I believe it too, and in order to get the money.
Right.
And it seemed like the same names were always on the committees and working on these different groups, and billions of dollars that they were dealing with. So it was definitely very political and not scientific at all.
Right.
Frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And like the author does provide references and documentation. And like I said, Gary Taubes has written a few books on this topic in even more excruciating detail, but all also using documentation. This is something that fires me up, and it's something that's near and dear to my heart, because the whole premise of Keyes initially saying this was that it was to prevent heart disease. He wanted, it seemed like he started off with good intentions, but he was such a stubborn prick that he
Right.
couldn't realize that his hypothesis was
Wrong.
potentially wrong. It's flat out wrong.
Right.
And, you know, I'll tell you guys a story. My dad got 4 stents put in September of last year, and I visited him at the hospital. He was in the cardiovascular wing in like their form of the ICU, and they were feeding him margarine, so something that is not good for your heart.
Right.
They were feeding him a whole bunch of stuff that was high in sugar, which is not good because he's also diabetic. And I'm just thinking to myself, you're supposed to have doctors and nurses who are specializing in cardiology. And it's all because you're right. And even in these major hospitals, if the American Heart Association does not approve of your practices, you will not get funding, and you will be ostracized in your community, and thus your hospital is going to go under. It's really an unfortunate circumstance. And it's good that this information is coming out there. But yeah, between that and just the politicization of in these different industries that didn't want to go under because the writing was on the wall as early as the late 40s, early 50s, it is extremely frustrating. And that's also something that I get fired up about personally, and why I wanted to share this book with you, so that you guys could kind of see in between the layers. I've touched on it here and there, but overall, now you guys are starting to see it for yourselves. So that's why I wanted to share this book with you guys.
But I think, you know, because I went to school for health education originally, and one of the things that always stuck with me is that they said doctors are trained in the medical field. They know about the body, but there's no connection to nutrition with that.
Sure.
And I mean, I just went to a gastroenterologist, very well respected, not long ago. And this is when I was having trouble, and it ended up being the stevia, but I had to figure it out on my own. And, you know, I was saying to him, I'm trying probiotics, and, you know, he's telling me, oh, try kimchi. I'm like, I've already done that. You know, he's giving me all these things that I already know because I've educated myself about. And then I said, you know, could it be stevia? He's like, what's stevia?
Oh, wow.
I didn't even know.
No. And I mean, stevia has been around a while. I mean, especially since it went processed with the Truvia and all the other ones.
Right.
I couldn't believe that the gastro didn't know what stevia was.
Right.
So that's one thing that I always keep in the back of my mind. They don't have the nutritional background that they really need to have. The second thing is they're so driven by the pharmaceutical companies.
Yep.
And I think especially with cholesterol levels, I mean, they just lowered what you need. So now they want to put you right on a drug.
Weed undoctored.
Yeah. And it amazes me. You know, and then you read about the effects of the statins and everything. And I don't know. I mean, I think people just in general think what their doctors say is it's right.
Yeah, it's gold. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can't. You have to take your health into your own hands, you know, with guidance from the professionals. But, you know, not every doctor is going to give you the right advice. And you have to understand that.
Right. And luckily, in recent years, there is, you know, a new branch. They call it functional medicine, you know, naturopaths and different doctors who do go to medical school. They have all similar training. The only difference is they often do not prescribe pills or surgeries when they feel that there's a viable, healthy alternative. And they do much more. Oh, go ahead.
The problem is they don't take insurance, or insurance
won't
cover them, really.
Insurance won't cover them.
The problem. Yep.
Yeah. And therein lies a huge issue with the health industry, which we can probably talk about for hours. But that the insurance companies will not. I mean, they're just started covering acupuncture and chiropractic recently, and even so, a lot of them don't. Like, I know my insurance, I have United Healthcare, does not cover chiropractic, so I have to pay for that out of pocket. And often you have to work out a deal if you want to get that type of treatment done. Same with acupuncture. I don't think it covers acupuncture either. So, and those are just two kind of ancillary things. So yeah, naturopath doctors, there's one near me that I really want to see who's very respected. And, you know, I've even read about him in books and stuff, but unfortunately, I think a first test is first appointment, it's 3 or 4 hours. They take your bloods and they do very thorough examinations of your body and everything, but it's like $600 and it's very expensive to continue to go to them. So I think until they figure out a way, and I have this crazy idea, and we probably don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I have this crazy idea where there's a way to kind of get the best of both worlds. Like the left wants everything socialized right now, and the right wants you to pay out of pocket for everything for insurance. I think there's a best of both worlds. I think we can socialize emergency medicine because you never know when you're going to wind up in the emergency room usually.
Right.
And going to a hospital or ER, it's $5,000. I got stitches in my hand a couple of years ago, and the bill was like $25,000, and I had to come up with the first couple because of my deductible. It was crazy. And that was just for an hour. I was taken right away. I was in and out in an hour, but it just all the crazy expenses. They charged my dad $150 for an aspirin when he was in the hospital.
Yeah,
and that's
isn't that crazy?
Yeah. So I think there's a way to socialize emergency medicine, and then that would in turn, if you're paying out of pocket, that would cause doctors' offices, because they kind of abuse the system too. They can charge insurance companies whatever they want, and the insurance companies will pay it. Whereas if they have to deal directly with the consumer for regular checkups and things like that, then they have to bring their prices down. And there are some medical practices, I'm not sure if you guys have read about it, that are actually having their patients pay some type like a monthly subscription, so that if you do go in and you have to get stuff done, whether it's blood, whatever, it's all covered already because you're paying $100 a month for it or whatever, which is cheaper than insurance, but for most people. So, yeah, I think until that's fixed, though, functional medicine is not going to be able to come to the forefront. That's going to pose a lot of issue for a lot of people in Western civilization. So, yeah, fun times. Any last thoughts on the first 3 chapters that we went over?
No.
Okay, cool.